spirit. It's compared to a dog. Pedigree dog, though, I'll have you notice. Dogs have to be trained. We want them to be fierce to our enemies. You want them barking, but you want to stop barking when you tell them to stop barking.
The democratic man, the free-loving hippie, all bets are loose.
It's anarchy, right? Democracy is a kind of anarchy.
Do not be shameful that you are using heroin. Be proud that you are using it cleanly. The egalitarian intuitions of democracy flatten everything out.
Authority is challenged, children are disobedient to their parents, masters come to resemble their dogs.
I've made some money, let me retreat and do philosophy in a walled-off garden. Why is that not a good move?
Plato's Republic is one of the foundational texts of the West. It's a timeless masterpiece that set the agenda for the next 2,000 years of Western philosophy. And yet, the Republic is hostile to almost everything the modern West stands for today. Democracy, equality, liberty, freedom of speech, tolerance, all of these are explicitly named by Plato in the Republic as things which produce bad lives and even worse societies. My guest today is a leading Plato scholar, Giovanni Ferrari, who will help us understand why the founding text of the West is so hostile to everything the modern West has become. Professor Ferrari is going to unpack the Republic for us through a central metaphor that Plato uses between cities and souls. Tyranny, right, a type of city, a type of state, is compared to a drunkard, a type of soul. Aristocracy is compared with a philosopher, and democracy is compared with an aimless dilettante. This is the central metaphor we're going to spend this entire interview unpacking, and it'll teach us why Plato despised democracy and what are the better ways to not only organize society, but our own lives. If you want to follow along this episode via transcript, or if you want to be invited to one of my lectures, then please join my email list at jonathanb.com. Without further ado, Giovanni Ferrari.
For Plato, the generation of states goes like aristocracy, a society of reason, Timocracy, society of spirit, of honor, oligarchy, society of appetite, of money, democracy, society of ruled by the people, and then finally tyranny. Let's start with democracy first, because I think our audience is gonna be able to recognize that in their own lives. Tell us about the nature of democratic society.
Well, we're not talking about democracy primarily in the political sense. It's more like the decadent society that people write books about these days, which can be connected with democracy.
Voting and yes.
Yeah, everyone is very proud of their freedoms and their political freedoms, and will not tolerate. It's surprisingly libertarian rather than power to the people. They won't tolerate too much government interference. Authority is challenged. Children are disobedient to their parents. Masters come to resemble their dogs, and so on. It's very anarchic, actually. It degenerates into anarchy because people just don't want to be ruled in this society. But what that corresponds to in the democratic individual is not someone who would be a member of that democratic society, necessarily a member of that democratic society as described. Instead, that kind of worship of fetishizing almost of freedom is one thing at the political level in a city as a whole, and quite another thing if we're just looking within the level of the soul. And the democratic, in the same way as everyone is equal, in a democratic society, politically equal. And you're not going to push me around, government's not going to push me around, my neighbor's not going to push me around. The democratic individual gives equal power, it's very equitable among his desires. And each of them get equal time. He's very fickle and whimsical. One day he's working out at the gym. The next day he's partying with his fraternity buddies. It's just...
He fails to make
has a new fad every day.
One of the key values that is attacked is equality. Let me give you a quote from the Republic. Anarchic and motley, democracy assigns a kind of equality indiscriminately to equals and unequals alike.
Yes.
Non-discrimination, equality, these are things for us that would be important political values. What does Plato see as the problem here?
He's not afraid to say that the best people are not accorded their full value. that he and Aristotle too support something they call proportional equality. In other words, people get the value they deserve.
Equality for equals, inequality for unequals.
Exactly.
Right? And so I think that the real issue of democracy for Plato must be that we fail to make distinctions between activities that we ought make distinctions. And maybe I can give you an example. I was riding the subway on New York, and there was an ad on the subway that said, "Do not be shameful that you are using heroin. Be proud that you are using it cleanly." And it was an advertisement for like one of those like safe heroin injection sites. And that is something that Plato is trying to get at here, right? Which is, no, maybe we should be shameful for certain types of activities. And the egalitarian intuitions of democracy flatten everything out, even when we should make distinctions.
Yes, I think he would, but notice that in Callipolis,
the ideal state, the aristocracy ruled by philosopher kings, yes?
Yeah, well, the heroin addicts won't be allowed to grow up, but unfortunates will be taken care of, taken into account. You know? It is very important to him that those who are ruled by philosophers agree to be ruled, that realize that will be much more beneficial for them than any of the current alternatives.
Right. What Plato attacks in his critique of democracy is not just equality, but also tolerance, liberty, freedom of speech. He names these explicitly as objects of critique.
Yeah, no, it's very...
I do find it quite fascinating that the foundational text, I think you can give a good argument that this is the foundational text of the Western canon, seems to be hostile to everything that the modern West today seems to stand for.
Well, you know, freedom to do what? If it's freedom to smoke crack, you know, that's not a freedom we want to preserve.
So let me give you another quote from the Republic. This is him describing the person you already brought up, which is the democratic man. Day by day, indulging the appetite of the day, now wine-bibbing and abandoning himself to the lascivious pleasing of the flute, and again drinking only water and dieting, at one time exercising his body, and sometimes idling and neglecting all things, and at another time seeming to occupy himself with philosophy, and frequently he goes in for politics and bounces up and says and does whatever enters his head. And if military men excite his emulation, thither he rushes, and if money men, to that he turns. And there's no order or compulsion in his existence. But he calls this life of his the life of pleasure and freedom and happiness. Kierkegaard described this type of man as performing crop rotation. What is wrong with such a life?
Well, that's something that projection onto the level of the city can help us see what Plato's answer would be. Democracy is, as he describes it, is a kind of anarchy. And there is a similar anarchy going on in the democratic person's soul. Because you read that and you think, oh, I've been there, you know.
Or even in California, they might think, great.
Well, exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And the equivalent of that at the level of the city is that, it contains all sorts of constitutions, so it's rather beautiful. It's like a beautiful, variegated
You want to do
world,
heroin? Great. You want to do this crazy thing? Even better, right?
Yes, and what Plato is encouraging us to find bad about that is that if there is no order in your life, how can that be a good feeling? Aren't you going to feel out of control if you don't know why you woke up this morning and this is what I felt like doing? At some point, you're going to ask yourself, where am I going with this? And you're not going to have the resources from which to come up with any kind of satisfying answer.
I see. And we already see the city soul analogy starting to pay off, right? Because when I just gave this description, again, we're filming this interview in California, maybe many Californians would say, well, this is fantastic. But if you compare that, if you think about that as the human level of what we described in the New York subway, of like doing heroin, great, there's no shame in that. Then you start seeing what potentially might be the problem in such a life. So it's from seeing the anarchy in the city and then projecting that on the man that we are able to see why Plato wants us to find a certain type of life that we previously found attractive, distasteful.
Yes, that's right. And I mean, I would say the problem with contemporary California is not that. That's more like 30 years ago, maybe. Summer of Love.
The hippie,
Summer of
yeah.
Love or something. It's all too moralistic these days in modern California. But setting that aside, it shows you that it doesn't matter whether it's true to contemporary California or whatever it would be. These are Hesiodic pictures of, mythical pictures of the ages of man, as it were. You recognize that picture and let's see what's wrong with it.
Right. Tell us about Plato's tripartite division of the soul.
Well, it is something that primarily comes up in his dialogue, The Republic. The kernel of it seems to be a fairly conventional contrast between reason and desire. And that gets complicated by a third element in the soul, usually translated as spirit, but not in the sense that we mean by spirit, but rather like as in high spirits. And these seem to be faculties, drives, and they each have their own ends. They each have desires associated with them, or may even be a kind of desire. That's left rather vague. But we find out that the lowest part, the appetitive part, is a drive towards material goods, material benefits. Spirit is a drive towards winning, status, socially conscious, and honor is important to it. And the most important reason has a purpose and a goal that it's trying to achieve. And that goal is truth, knowledge, understanding.
Now that we've analyzed democracy, I want to understand how the transition happens to tyranny. And I'll give you a quote from the Republic. Any excess is wont to bring about a corresponding reaction to the opposite in the seasons, in plants, in animal bodies, and most especially in political societies. And so the probable outcome of too much freedom is only too much slavery in the individual and the state. How does the most freedom-loving state, democracy, degenerate into the least freedom-loving state, tyranny?
Because they love their freedom so much that they think only that guy can fix it, right? And so they make him their champion to restore their freedoms.
Right.
It's simply an astute political analysis.
So now let's actually move on to tyrannical society itself. Tell us about how Plato described tyranny.
Well, he makes sure that he's describing a tyranny run by an actual tyrannical character, in this case, because he wants to prove that the unjust man who gets away with his injustice is actually going to be the unhappiest of all, right? So we want a tyrannical soul, which in ways that we can go on to discuss is the unhappiest kind of soul, to be given the power to indulge its desires to the fullest extent possible, which he will do if that tyrannical character gets to become an actual tyrant and have absolute power in the city. And there are many more pages devoted to the long rise of this demagogic champion into becoming a tyrant of a city than there is of the life of the city, because it was all kind of too familiar. This is where the city and the man come together, because in any tyranny, the political system is basically
one man.
The reflection of one man.
Right.
The city is l'état c'est moi. I mean, the city is this man, and he, if he hires the best musicians and poets from Athens to come and...
It's about him.
It's about him. It's about him, the glittering buildings and all of that.
Right, his
the building
statues,
program.
right.
This is all me. I made this city for you. Aren't I great?
Right, and Plato describes, again, very presciently, how he would even start wars to ensure that he stays in power. So the entirety of the state's resources is being directed for him.
And so everyone else in the city is an appendage of him.
Right.
All the other citizens are his slaves, in fact.
Right. Now tell us about the soul of the tyrannical man.
If you mentioned the heroin addict, it is a kind of life of an addict, is what it sounds most like, in that he takes the most overriding impulse that any Greek would think of, which is our erotic impulse, and allows that to dominate the person. And the that becomes the tyrant of his soul, kicks out all the worldly
Erotic
desires.
meaning literally lust, like sexual.
It starts out as literally lust, but then it gets extended to he's like a man who is drunken. That seems to be just to soften us up for the idea of becoming dominated by one
Completely
appetite.
unruly person, right?
That's right. When you are completely overtaken by lust, it can turn you into nothing but an incarnation of your own lust.
So to help our audiences understand, if the democratic man is this kind of free love hippie crop rotation, the tyrannical man is a drunkard. Something like that. Like someone whose singular desire is totally out of control, that their entire lives are just engaged in satisfying that one desire. It's an addict, essentially.
Yes, and completely out of control and like a crazy person.
I see. I'll give you a quote here. The tyrannical man does not set out to enslave himself, but inevitably, it is what he ends up doing. That would be why there's repeated mention of the mischance or misfortune that compels a tyrannical man to become a tyrant. There's a lot of interesting claims here. Number one is that the tyrant is actually a slave in some sense. Mm-hmm. And number two is that the actualized tyrant, the tyrant who actually gets his way, is worse off than the would-be tyrant. Mm-hmm. A drunkard who gets access to all the alcohol he can is worse than someone who only labors every day to get a bottle of wine or something like that. Help us make sense of his description here.
Yes. So it's called a mischance because he thinks he's getting exactly what he wants.
Right. The drunkard thinks getting unlimited lifetime supply of right.
Oh my God. But what it will make of him, by the time he discovers that, it'll be too late if he ever does. Presumably he won't have the self-awareness to discover it. If again we apply the analogy, you look at the whole city, almost everyone in the city, except for the tyrant, is miserably enslaved. And therefore the city as a whole, if we look at the city as a whole, the city is miserable. It's a miserable city. There's only one guy in his palace that is seeming to do what he wants and strutting the international stage in a grand fashion. Then Plato wants to show us that even that guy is not happy. And I'll show you why, because I'll imagine a tyrannical character that gets to be the guy in the palace. Inside his soul, yes, there is one appetite that is getting to do what it wants, to bully the rest of the soul. But
it's a base appetite. It's the worst one, right?
And you have to believe that there is such a thing as human nature. There is such a thing as living out the fullness of your human soul in all its parts. Having a human life that involves all elements of your makeup,
right,
and then dedicating that life to God, is the kind of, that's what a philosophic life would be. Because the tyrant, that one appetite that gets to do exactly what he likes, if you are not yet that person, Plato hopes to have convinced you that this would be a terrible fate, because you have so impoverished your life. And it doesn't matter whether you are a successful tyrant and you die in your bed.
Right.
You have lived within your soul this terribly impoverished life for all of that time.
So this is the real payoff, I think, in Tyranny when you draw the analogy, which is that it's very easy to see why in a tyrannical society, the whole society, except the smallest part is enslaved. It's less clear to see why in an actual tyrant, an actual addict, how that happens until you draw the analogy. And so it's by drawing this analogy that you realize the actual tyrant himself, even or maybe especially the tyrant that gets his way, is actually a slave. And that's the great irony.
Yes.
So let's move on. We talked about the worst state of tyranny. Let's move on to the best state. So tell us about aristocratic society.
Aristocratic society, as portrayed in the Republic, is one in which philosophers rule. Philosophers are living the best life, the fullest life, and developing in them what is best in any human being. But they're the one, not everyone can do that. In fact, most people can't do that. So what do you do with everyone else? Because the philosopher is not alone. How do you take care of them such that the society as a whole can be thought to be an aristocracy in the true sense of the Greek word? The best kind of rule will make the best society. It's not just that the best people are in charge, but that the society as a whole will be the best society? Well, Plato's idea is that in Callipolis, everyone will get to do the job for which they are suited and can be happiest in. He's not trying to send everyone to college. He's not trying to. The way to improve society is to make everyone.
Right.
Like,
some people should go to trade school. Some people should go to trade school. Some people should go to college.
It is something
right.
like that.
Right.
You know, he's not trying to persuade the farmers and the artisans that, you know what, family life isn't all it's cracked up to be. You don't have to have all those kids, and no, find satisfaction in this job. Have a family life. As we know, this is a society in which all the wealth is owned by the lowest class.
Right.
The people.
The merchants, right.
The merchants and the farmers, as he divides them up. And the soldiers and the philosophers who emerge from the soldier class, the ones that are capable of philosophy, have no money, basically. They subsist on a modest tithe, a tax that the producers, the productive classes, concede to them, because they see that why do they do this? Why are they inclined to do this? Because they see that things are much better for them. They're getting the kind of satisfactions that they want out of life.
So to summarize what you're saying, there's three classes in the Callipolis, the aristocracy, the best state. There's the philosopher kings, there's the guardians, or these are the soldiers, and then there's the producers, the farmers, the merchants, the craftsmen. And what I found interesting in your depiction is the different mechanisms by which the philosopher king manages these two classes. And I should also add that the philosopher king symbolizes reason in the soul, the guardian's spirit, and the producer's appetite. So the philosopher king doesn't try to convince the guardians and give them a rational philosophical argument. They use myth to guide their spirited drives into doing good for the state. And so maybe this is, patriotic songs or something, right? I think he describes the ideal soldier almost like a dog who just protects his own. Whereas for the merchant class, I think at least in the first iteration of the Callipolis, he removes all of the adults and he starts in a fresh batch of only children because they're more malleable. And that's the way that the philosophers deal with appetite, is that they remove the ones that are impossible to deal with and mold the other ones. Is that a good understanding?
Yes. I have in this rather blasé way just now described the productive classes as, they'll be happy with their family life. And I can imagine someone protesting, but they have no political rights. They have no political power. All the political power is held by the rulers. This is political slavery, isn't it? But no one is insistent on rights in Callipolis. The city it's run by people for whom the city is not the be-all and end-all. It's run by people who don't want to, who have reserve about ruling in the first place. So this is a city where you get away from finding your meaning in political life, and instead, it's like one big family, this society, where you're getting on with doing your job for the city, so you have loyalty and so on, but it's not about, it's not about working out the political relations between the classes. So hence you start with a clean slate.
Right. And so what this reminds me of is that famous line from Confucius, 君君臣臣父父子子, that the ruler has what the ruler needs to do, that the subject does what the subject's supposed to do, the father does what the father is supposed to do, and the son does what the son is supposed to do. Everyone has their exact role. Except for the philosopher king, right? Because the philosopher king's education is musical education before he's 20, it's mathematics 20 to 30, dialectic 30 to 35, practical matters 35 to 50, and then 50 plus, whoever is remaining, some of them become philosopher kings. So the best element is something that actually does not follow this singular logic of just you do your task.
Well, I wouldn't myself use the variety of his education in order to, what he's trying to become is a
singular,
complete person,
right.
and whose single commanding goal is to live the philosophic life. So in that sense, I think he stays integrated. But you're quite right to say that he doesn't just do one job, because famously he does two jobs. He's not just a philosopher, but he has to rule. But the crucial thing there is that ruling is ancillary to the philosopher's sense of himself.
Right. Before we talk about what I think is the most fascinating question in all the Republic, which is why in the world does the philosopher come back to rule? Describe to us the structure of the philosopher king's soul and how it's mirrored in the city. So tell us about the philosopher's man.
Okay, so yes, which is not actually a task that is not performed in the Republic itself.
So you're saying even though tyrannical man is described, even though democratic man is described, the actual structure of the three components of the philosopher is not described.
It is in the sense that in Book 4, the just person is described. Reason is in command of his soul, spirit is its ally, and together those two rule over the appetitive, the materialistic part. And that is going to be true of the philosopher as well. But as an experiment, I did take up what I take to be Plato's invitation that we pay out the analogy in a bit more detail.
Please, yes.
Because Callipolis is, what's characteristic about Callipolis as opposed to simply the society described in Book 4 where the rulers, for all we are told, are simply generals, simply good managers, simply good strategists and so on. When rulers become philosophers, okay, so what is characteristic of Callipolis? Philosophers are in charge. They get put there by some necessity. You know, they are compelled to go back down into the cave, though they accept it. Compelled in the sense that pressure is put on them, but they accept that pressure. They recognize its justice, and so they're not dragged down, kicking and screaming. There's some kind of necessity, and also, as you pointed out, the soldier class, they're given myths, and they're even there is a measure of deception in the way that they are. They're not allowed to know everything that's going on until they become philosophers. It's a security state in that sense. And what that corresponds to in the soul is that it corresponds to one big transition that from the rational part as simply a managerial faculty to being the love of wisdom, So that's the equivalent of the rulers of this city are not just managers or generals, they are philosophers.
They have their own ends.
They have their own life to live as philosophers, distinct from the city. That's one correspondence. The necessity is that he distinguishes necessary desire within the appetite, the materialistic part. He distinguishes necessary from unnecessary desires. Necessary desires are not just mere subsistence desires, but are, healthy desires. So you eat a healthy diet. There's good for the natural, good for you, what your biological nature demands. It's not just, you don't have a starvation diet. It's not ascetic. To the clean slate and taking the kids away from their parents and so on, he does try to just banish his, the metaphor is used, banish within his soul the lawless and unnecessary appetites that can spring up.
In the same way that the philosopher exiles the parents, at least in the first generation of the Callipolis, the philosopher within his soul, reason exiles the unnecessary, unmanageable desires.
That's right. And Plato is pretty optimistic about that. He said, if you try hard enough, you can do that, right? They may crop up in your dreams, but you can be forgiven for that. It's like Augustine. He completely controlled his sexual appetite, but he confesses that at night, in his dreams. But he doesn't like it, but he feels that if he's got it down to that, he feels he's doing okay.
So how is spirit utilized in the philosopher's soul?
Well, the spirit has to be made the ally of reason in the philosopher's soul. And there is a potential roadblock to that happening in that spirit is and needs to be naturally fierce. It's compared to a wild animal, a lion in the soul. And you are, in some sense, the sense in which this corresponds to the deceptive moves that are taken in Callipolis, such as there's a rigged lottery that gets the couplings of male and female soldiers, for example. It's famous. A noble lie is told to them. It's called a noble lie, but it's really just a myth. It's just a patriotic myth. These sorts of things at the city level, is there something deceptive going on in the soul? Only in the sense that spirit has to be acculturated, has to be tamed, while retaining its strong energy, but it can't be allowed to just be a wild animal in
like
the
a war elephant.
soul.
Its strength is still there, but it falls under the command of reason.
Yes, that's right. And in particular, spirit is what's going to help you get rid of the lawless and unnecessary appetites in your soul, because you can't just reason it out. Those things are powerful, and you need a sense of shame to help you there. And shame is what spirit is good at feeling. That kind of, and indignation. Why?
Right.
This is no part of me. I'm better than that. I'm going to get. So by acculturating spirit, you get it to be reason's ally. And the only sense in which that is a deception is simply that spirit is naturally fierce. And the lawless appetites it's getting rid of are also naturally fierce. They're like wild animals. There's something wild about spirit that has to be controlled. There's something, it's compared to a dog, pedigree dog though, I'll have you notice, but it's compared to a dog. Dogs have to be trained. We want them to be fierce to our enemies. When there's a disreputable person at the door, you want them barking, but you want to stop barking when you tell them to stop barking.
Right, I see. In the same way that the philosopher kings needs the help of the soldiers to take away the kids, right, the malleable people, and to exile the parents, the rational part of the soul requires spirit in helping it fight the bad desires. And to spell this out, and I think this is a great place to bring back the heroin example, because that's an example where spirit is made to ally with desire. Feel proud you are using heroin cleanly.
Yes. Right.
Whereas in Callipolis, you're supposed to use shame.
Yes.
It's shameful that you're using heroin. And the idea is that only shame, only honor is strong enough to combat the equally strong drive of an addiction like that, right?
Yes.
Is there any other positive use of spirit in the philosopher's soul other than getting rid of the bad desires, other than a negative drive? For example, what about the desire for philosophical glory or something like that? Can it accelerate you on the drive towards wisdom, for example?
Within the philosopher's soul, he can feel a patriotic pride in the excellence of Callipolis. And
so it's not just about shame and getting rid of bad desires, right?
No, you can take legitimate pride in the brotherly spirit, in the brotherly and sisterly spirit that prevails in Callipolis, if you have succeeded in doing that. This is the point where Socrates has said that most philosophers, given how bad politics is and the life is around them in their cities, shelter from the political storm behind a wall where they just do their philosophy. And Adeimantus says, that's not such a bad life. That's pretty good going, isn't it? And Socrates says, well, but in his own city, he will become a greater person. He will save his city as well as himself. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a better philosopher. Callipolis doesn't need to exist for you to live a full philosophic life, but it is the case that he will become a more complete person because he gets to be a successful ruler who helps others, and in the same way that he does not simply dismiss, in a Stoic fashion, try to dismiss completely keep down the other parts of himself, but rather give them their due. So he gives to all the other citizens their due and wants to give them the proportion of happiness to which they can attain. So there is that as well, that spirit helps him in, because if he becomes a greater person, he feels more pride in himself. And finally, spirit is intrinsically noble. Right. There's something noble about the philosophic life as well, and spirit will value the philosophic. It will admire the philosophers for their philosophic life.
So therefore, the philosopher does feel spirited desire to be a philosopher. Like his recognition is directed towards philosophy. It's not just reason that compels him to the end of reason, which is wisdom, but spirit also partially compels him on this path. And an example here would be he desires the honor of other philosophers he respects, or something like that.
That's right. That's right. He values the philosophic life over other kinds of life. It's an assignment of value, and it's pride taken in that value. Sure.
This is a great segue to talk about what I think is the most interesting question in the Republic, if not all of Plato, which is the philosophical life is the best life. And yet, the philosopher in the best city does not get to fully live just the best life and also becomes a king. Why is that?
I mean, he was brought up for the task.
Right.
He kind of...
he's expecting it. He's expecting it. He is told that he has to repay his student loans, as it were. You know, he has to pay back for his upbringing. He owes it to the city. And remember, he's not just a philosopher. He came up as a soldier. I know it's supposed to be this giant puzzle, but I never quite feel that it is so terribly surprising. I mean, we should distinguish it from the question, in other words, why would the philosopher agree? Right.
There is the further question whether it makes his life
better or worse.
That's right.
Yeah.
You see, and then
so let's talk about the latter question. That's the really interesting. Right?
Yes, I think that is the deeper question. And Plato's philosopher has a tragic sense of life. The tragedy is that although the philosopher will agree to rule the city, he will think of it as the right thing to do, he can still wish that he never had to, that this never had to be done. He could wish that he lived only among other philosophers in the Elysian fields, but he's a human being. He recognizes he's a human being. He recognizes his fallen condition. So Callipolis is the best human society, is the best that a human society can be, but definitely the place where the strain is felt most is not among the farmer and the artisan class.
Right.
They're doing very nicely.
Right.
Much
Or
better
the soldiers. Or the
soldiers. They're doing much better than in most surrounding Greek societies. The strain is felt among the rulers, in the ruling class.
Right. I believe one of Plato's interlocutors says, after he describes how they make no money and there's all these strains, he's like, well, who would want to rule there? And Plato says, I'm not building the best city for the rulers. I'm building the best city, period. And here we actually see another, I think, very delicate city and soul metaphor in reincarnation. It's the rational, the best part of ourselves that reincarnate. And yet after every reincarnation, it finds itself among lowly parts, spirit and appetite. And the philosopher is the exact same. It would be great if there was a city of just philosophers. No one needed to rule. It was the libertarian paradise where it was just self-organizing. But that's not the people, realistically, that the philosopher is going to find himself with, right? So that's the point you're saying.
Yes, and the philosopher is someone that wants to know reality, which includes human beings in their fullness.
Right. So let me give you a quote from your book. And I think this is a very fascinating counterpoint to what we talked about the tyrant. The fulfillment of the tyrant's ambition to gain a tyranny turned out to be the one thing that could make his own condition yet more miserable. So the philosopher's acceding to power turns out equally unexpectedly to be the one thing that can make his own condition yet finer. It is equally unexpected, but not for the reason that applies to the tyrant. In the tyrant's case, it is odd, or at least ironic, that the fulfillment of a person's ambition should turn out to be his ruin. But the benefit the philosopher derives from powers is unexpected just because power was never his ambition. So what is the answer to the question, does the philosopher live a better life as a king? Here you suggest that he does live a better life in some sense as a king. But that seems to contradict with Plato's general assertion that the philosophical life of contemplation and not political rule is the best life. How do we square these two observations?
We do not square them ultimately, because human life is not square. I'm not enough of a mathematician to say what polygon it might be, but it has bristly edges. It's imbarnacled, right? If he becomes a better philosopher, it would only be in practical senses. Practical
wisdom. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, well, in the sense that he's living in a society that admires its and supports its philosophers. He's not like Socrates in danger of being hauled up on a capital charge. And gets to, when he's king, he gets to spend most of his time actually doing philosophy with his fellow philosophers. So it's really pretty nice setup.
You preserve part of the philosophical life, yes.
Most of it. He just takes his turn when the time comes. But, well, I shouldn't say most of it in the sense that there is a long, long apprenticeship, and he is having to live for the city more than would be a philosopher's natural inclination. That is certainly true, and that's part of the sacrifice that he has to make. There's lots that he has to sacrifice. Poetry gets sacrificed. But he gets to become, as I said, a greater person, finer in that sense, by a more complete human being by saving his city as well as himself.
Are you comfortable with the following statement? He becomes a greater person even if he lives a worse life. And what I'm trying to say is that the philosopher king, in some sense, is a greater person because of his engagement in society. But surely Plato must concede, given what he says about the contemplative and political life, that he lives in some sense a worse life, right? Even if that sacrifice is worthwhile. Would you be comfortable with that?
See, I always have to weasel out of it by saying this. He's not living a worse human life. He's living the best human life. But a philosopher is godlike as well as human. The philosophic part is that Plato is always saying that throughout the dialogues. It's the godlike part of us. And the way around that is what I said earlier, which is that the philosophic life is a human life that is offered up to the divine. You complete it by living out a full lifespan. But what makes it worthwhile is beyond the span of your human life and beyond your single human life. In that sense, there's something religious about it. It sounds a lot like a Christian might talk about living their life for God. So because the human and the divine cannot smoothly be reconciled, that I would want to say that he doesn't live a worse human life.
Right.
But he aspires constantly to the best divine life that he could live.
I see. And unfortunately, for Plato scholars as yourself, I think that this is the easier version of the question, which is, what does a philosopher do in the good state? Because there's a slightly harder question, which is, what does he do in a bad state? You mentioned that some of Plato's interlocutors suggest quietism, and here's the intuition. This is a bad state. If I engage, I'm going to admire my own soul. I've made some money somewhat. Let me retreat and do philosophy in an almost Epicurean walled-off garden. Why is that not a good move?
It may well be the best move in a bad society. Plato doesn't owe anything to Athens, unlike Socrates. Nonetheless, what he chose to do, whether or not we trust in the stories of what he tried to do in Sicily with the Sicilian tyrant and maybe training him up, but he certainly took on educational obligations, and he wrote the Republic, which I take to be sincerely utopian and written mostly to praise the philosophic life and convert its readers, make them admire the philosophic life, but partly also with a sense that this is a text that can circulate among... he had some powerful people come to his school, people that actually ruled small island states and could try and put some things into practice.
Right.
Spreading these ideas around.
Right. What I'm hearing from you is, unlike the philosopher in Callipolis, he doesn't own any student loans. He doesn't owe society a debt for bringing him up. And so this decision to just be a philosopher and not engage in politics can be more justified, it seems like, or it can be an option. Yes. However, I think what you're gesturing at is that there's still an impulse of wanting to do something, even for a bad state. Let me give you a quote from your book. The gentlemanly ethos of quietism and retreat, then, is not sufficient. There is a noble sort of profit-seeking, a pursuit of ends by laborious means that does not borrow from the ethos of the businessman. The instrument of this noble profit-seeking is an entire philosophic life. You seem to be suggesting that the philosopher in a bad state has some kind of profit-driven motive to engage in politics. Did I read you right?
That passage comes from a different context.
Right.
So I should make
please.
myself clear there. That is the highest thing a philosopher can do. Also, hiding behind the wall and not even writing the Republic. Not engaging in. That is what I'm describing as offering up your philosophic life to the divine. That's seen as a kind of noble profit-seeking in the sense that, in the sense of what does it profit a man to gain all the wealth in the world and lose the kingdom of heaven?
So this is the life of retreat. This is the life of dedication.
Could well be the life of retreat, or it could be the life of someone who involved himself somewhat in politics, but knows where the highest profit is to be found, namely in the pure philosophic life. If he nevertheless decides to, I think that, I'll tell you what I think gives you, where Plato wrote a sentence that perhaps encapsulates his own motive for going to Sicily,
right? Trying to teach,
getting involved, being a
yes.
teacher, spreading, proselytizing, and so on, being involved.
Right. In what he conceives to be a bad state, right? So this is exactly
even
this
if it's
example,
a bad state,
right?
and he's trying to improve things. In the dialogue called the Timaeus, where we have a craftsman god who finds matter in disorder and puts it into order and creates our world in that way, shapes it into the most beautiful form that matter can. Why did he do it? He's a perfectly rational god. He's completely happy in himself. Why did he do it? Answer, sentence from the Timaeus, he was good. And being good, he wanted everything around him to also be as good as it could possibly be. And I think of Plato's motivation, social motivation, in the same way.
Are you comfortable with this statement about the true philosopher in the bad state, which is unlike the true philosopher in the best state, in Callipolis? There's no necessary imperative to engage in politics. It's much more of a calculus between how much you can help the society, there's an imperative there, and how much you yourself will be damaged in the process. If this is an absolutely terrible state, you know you're going to get killed. Maybe retreating to the walled garden is the best way to, as you say, noble profit seeking, to dedicate yourself to the divine through a philosophic life. So it becomes much more of a calculus and an option.
Plato got the hell out of Sicily when things got too hot, right?
Right, I see. So another very fascinating quality of his ideal state is that it degenerates. He anticipates it will end, right? Aristocracy degenerates into, there's two more constitutions we need to examine. Aristocracy degenerates into Timocracy. Tell us about why it collapses.
The health of aristocracy depends on the health of its ruling, the spiritual health, spiritual and moral health of its ruling class. The Republic has plenty to say about eugenics. It involves that class continuing to breed true. So it's an accident. Basically, it degenerates because all matter degenerates. It's a realistic utopia, right. And eventually, not everyone is going to be. You're going to get some less than stellar characters born, even among the ruling class. Someone's going to fail to notice it until it's too late, and so on. Right. It's kind of the
realism.
Accident. It's realism. It's an accident, but it's an accident to which we are always prone as human beings, and so over a certain length of time, right. It's going to happen. Right. So Plato is simply being realistic there.
So a democracy is a society grounded on honor, revolving around spirit. So tell us about the nature of such a society.
Well, so they no longer give intellect. They no longer honor intellect. It gets reduced to a nice thing to do when you're, like Callicles in the Gorgias says, philosophy it's all very well to talk philosophy when you're young, but then go out and enter civic life and become a real man, So it's that kind of a society in which military values are uppermost, and a sense of honor, sense of gentlemanliness, and the producers, and interestingly, the key to it is they no longer respect the producers and artisans as they were respected, in the sense of, you have a job to do, thank you for the tithe, thank you for producing the corn, and so on. That no longer happens. They become slaves, basically, helots. They become serfs.
Right. And what does such a society honor? What is honor directed to? Is it military glory?
Yes, military glory, and so the serfs are despised. They're not valued. They have no. Their life has no honor. So you look down on those below you. You look up to those above you. You kiss up and you
belittle the
down.
ones.
It gets pretty bad pretty quick.
I see. And what is the nature of timocratic man, and how does he relate to this polis?
Well, he doesn't have to be. He doesn't have to be a member of a timocracy. He does value the military. He has that same, in the same way as the society puts its military in charge. Its rulers are generals now, like Sparta, as in Sparta. It's modeled on Sparta. So he, within his soul, puts his military first in the sense that he values honor. He values being socially above others. He values aggressively making his way in the world and holding a high position.
The Republic tells the birth of the timocratic man, and I believe it goes something like his mother, as well as his peers around him, bully him, make fun of him, because his father didn't accomplish anything of great renown. And so that's why he develops this lust for honor. But what's really fascinating is that initially, his honor keeps his desires, like the desire for making money, in check when he's young. However, as he gets older, he becomes like the oligarchic man, that those desires let loose and honor can no longer keep him to what appears to be virtue, at least in the beginning. And what I find so interesting there is, in the good society and in the philosopher's soul, honor is also initially keeping the desires in check. But because reason is stewarding honor, because it's reason and honor against appetite, I think what Plato wants to tell us is that that is a much more stable configuration than just using honor. And to translate this into modern parlance, if the reason that you don't drink a lot, that you don't do drugs, that you don't do criminal offenses, that you don't steal other people's property is just shame, well, that might give away quite quickly, right? When people aren't looking, you might start doing those things. So it's reason. Reason is the ultimate guardian against those bad things.
Yeah, what are you being honored for? It's got to be for something good, and it's reason that can give you something good.
So Timocracy degenerates into the last regime we're going to observe, which is oligarchy. Tell us about that transition.
Well, cities degenerate into other cities, and individuals degenerate because of their family background. So the oligarchic character had a timocratic character for a father who was serving as a general, but then got into political trouble, was exiled or whatever, lost his power. That taught his son a bitter lesson and said, I need a more secure value. What's going to be more secure? Money. I can rely on that.
Right. Because honor, it fluctuates with people's opinions, but you can always have
too
money.
Unstable. Right? So that's how he becomes, that's the main motivator for his degeneration.
Right. And the oligarchic society is a society oriented around wealth. Is that right?
Yes.
So tell us about how that society is organized.
It is an oligarchic society because the rich are in power. Wealth is the qualification for rule. So again, all the societies are described purely in political terms. They're not described as full of money lovers. It includes all sorts of rich people, decent rich people, sober rich people, and profligate rich people.
Right.
The crucial thing is this, that they are all rich and therefore they rule. It's not till you get to within the oligarchic soul that you see someone who loves money and in a miserly way. Again, Plato is always, comes back to what we were saying before, Plato is always keeping the city and the soul
separate in some degree.
In some parallel tracks, even for their degeneration. That's why he does not, as he could so easily have, describe the degeneration of the person in terms of civic background and social influences.
But family, right?
Just family. He restricts it to family. I know that's social, but he keeps it on a separate source.
So in Oligarchy, Plato describes the city as split into two. But in Timocracy, he does not make that description. And yet in Timocracy, it kind of can be seen as two already, right? Because you have the ruling military honor class versus the kind of enslaved producer class. However, it's only an oligarchy where he says that the city is split in two. Why is that?
Because only that's interesting, and it's indicative of how carefully he's paying out the analogy. Only the oligarchic character is a conflicted character. That's not true of all the characters. It's not true of the Timocratic character that he is conflicted. If he ends up valuing money more, he's not conflicted about it. That just happens when he gets old, when he gets an older man.
Right.
Whereas the oligarchic character has a better kind of appetite, materialistic appetite, the necessary appetites, suppressing his unnecessary appetites. So his appetitive part is split, is at war with itself.
Right.
And why is it conflicted? Because it is kept down not by the reasoning part, this is said explicitly in the text, not by the reasoning part, but by fear and force, namely by the force of the necessary appetites. And it's always there, ready to erupt, because it is simply suppressed. If you get that guy, if you give that guy guardianship of orphans, watch how he abuses those poor orphans. Because those horrible, unnecessary and lawless appetites are all there in him. They're just being kept down by, oh, I don't want to, I want to stay respectable on the outside. I don't want to lose my money. I don't want to lose my...
Right. But isn't also that a description of the Timocratic man? Because the Timocratic man, like we described, in his youth, he uses his honor. Oh, I don't want people to think that I'm a drunkard, to suppress, in this case, his desire to drink. But in old age, I agree with you, there's no more conflict in old age because like the appetite has just run free. So why is that not a conflict? And why is the oligarch?
Well, because he's perfectly, he's not suppressing anything when his honor is in control of him as a young person.
Doesn't honor have to suppress the desire to drink in order for him to not to do that?
But it does that trouble-free, not by fear or force. Honor, when it is in its good, in its good manifestation, is a moral sense, and saying this is a decent person who is the kind of person I value, the kind of person I want to be, is not going to does not consider these.
I see.
Does not consider this a good, respectable way to live.
Whereas in the oligarchic soul, his actually appetitive part is split into two, is what you're saying.
I really want to do this, but the only reason I'm not going to do it is because it would foil my
money-making abilities.
That's right. I'd like to do both, but I can't, unfortunately.
I
Whereas
see.
the honor lover doesn't feel that way. He doesn't want to do the other thing.
Right.
Because honor's in control of a sense of honor, a decent thing.
I see. Let me give you a quote from the Republic. This might be one of my favorite quotes today, and it's to describe how in the oligarchic soul, appetite is like a Persian despot. Such a man will then establish on that throne the principle of appetite and avarice, and set it up as the great king in his soul, adorned with tiaras and collars of gold, and girt with the Persian sword. And under this domination, he will force the rational and high-spirited principles to crouch lowly to right and left as slaves, and will allow the one to calculate and consider nothing but the ways of making money from a little, and the other to admire and honor nothing but riches and rich men. Mm-hmm. Now that we've examined all of the four degenerate types, let's attempt to give a summary and put them side by side. Oligarchic man, appetite is split into two, and an appetite enslaves both reason and spirit. Timocratic man, honor is trying to suppress appetite as much as possible, which eventually lets loose, and reason is just seen as some nice pastime. Reason has lost its end in wisdom. Mm-hmm. Democratic man, everything is kind of equal. It has no preference. Like all three parts of the soul and the different desires within each part of the soul are seen as equal.
Correct, yeah.
The tyrannical man, the worst kind, the basis of his desires, let's say drinking, rules everything. That's the story that Plato wants to paint.
Nicely put.
So the final transition that we need to talk about, and we've come full circle now, is how does oligarchy become democracy, and how does oligarchic man beget democratic man?
So oligarchy becomes democracy because the rich are not very serious about being warlike. The soldiers, the general people that have to go out and fight the wars for them, begin to notice that they're out of condition and they're not very, we could take them, they start to say. And eventually they do, because everyone wants money here. The suppressed people want money, and it's just that only the rich have it. So when you all want the same thing, and the ones that don't have it, the have-nots, notice that the haves are rather weak in terms of their resources of force. Okay, there's a revolution. Let's take it over.
Right. But why does democracy come out of that?
Because it's the people that are taking over.
I see. It's the producers who are the have-nots.
Yeah, they're the ones that go. They're the have-nots who go out and they're the foot soldiers.
I see.
In battles and so on.
So it's clear that tyranny is the worst state, right? And aristocracy is the best state. But within the three intermediate state, is there a sense where one is worse than the other, or are they just bad in different ways?
Oh, no, it is meant to be a degeneration from better to worse.
I see.
So you're going down a scale. So when honor is in charge, I mean, that's a moral sense is in charge, and people value what is noble. They value what is noble.
Even if it can't hold on for an entire life or something like that.
Even if it won't hold on, even if it's not secure. In modern terms, the most difficult one to see as a degeneration is from oligarchy to democracy.
Yes, right.
And there the reason is that he says that of the oligarchic character, he says that he's going to living with his necessary desires in control of his unnecessary desires. He's going to live a very respectable life, in a kind of Victorian sense,
Right. His desire for making money, of not wanting to ruin his business contacts, is going to protect the worst excesses from happening.
Exactly.
Whereas the democratic man, the free-loving hippie, all bets are loose.
It's anarchy, right?
Right. And the tyrannical man, it's not anarchy. It's his worst desires are standing on top.
Let me make sure to push those worst desires to the max,
I see. Anything else that you think the Republic has to share with contemporary society right now?
Do not sink all your value into a political life, into civic life. It's the difference between living for God, living for the divine, and living for one's place in human society.
But at the very same time, reminding even the philosopher that there might be some reasons to save the city.
Yes, because the philosopher has to acknowledge that they're human too.
I see. Thank you, Professor. Thanks for a fascinating interview.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
3 parts of the soul: spirit, the social part; desire, the part we share with animals; and reason, not only with their own faculties, but also with their own separate ends. Maybe we can tease out what's special about this conception if we compare it to a popular, unfortunately in my opinion, modern conception of the soul, of human nature, which is Homo economicus. And in this reduced picture, it's just reason instrumentally satisfying appetite, right? Maybe this is the British utilitarians, or a caricature of them is who you can have in mind, just calculating, maximizing one's utils. Compared against this picture of the soul, right? Reason, instrumental, appetite with its own ends. There's spirit that Plato has, that this modern conception doesn't. And importantly, reason has its own end, right? It's not just instrumental for doing other things. So, in other words, this could be read as a critique of modernity's conception of man as very reduced and too minimalistic.
Well, the richness of this tripartite account is that it raises the question of which part is going to be in charge, right? Which part is going to rule, as he likes to put it. This is, and that determines the kind of life that you're going to lead. So there is a Homo economicus, if you like, or something close to it, except that spirit is also included, in Book 8 of the Republic, and that is the oligarchic man.
Right, which we'll talk about today, character. Right? Someone who's driven by the desire for money, primarily, right?
And when Socrates delves into the soul of that person, he says that reason and also spirit, have been made to sit. The King Appetite, he imagines him as an Eastern potentate, with
A Persian despot, you're right.
Persian despot, exactly. And has made reason and spirit sit at his feet like slaves. So Homo economicus is simply someone, you didn't have to wait for the utilitarians to come around. Plato is well aware of this character, and he sees him as someone who has demeaned his reasoning part, which all of us have, by turning it into a mere calculator. Back in Book 4, reason was treated as a calculative part. It was called the calculative part in Greek. But now we see later on in the Republic that to be a mere calculator is not to be true to the deepest motivations of reason, not to be true to its drive. And therefore, there's going to be payback. There is a kind of kinship between Plato and Freud in that if you enslave a part, Freud talks about repression. Plato doesn't have a conception of repression.
He uses political terms like enslavement.
Yes.
Right.
But if you do enslave your best part, which is the part that seeks truth and understanding, this part that seeks wisdom, it is going to make your life a mean, shabby thing. You're going to be conflicted. In the case of the oligarchic man, in various ways, your life will be less happy, less full, less integrated than if you allow the best part of you, the rational part, to rule, to be in charge.
What this makes me think of is looking at Homo economicus. It does raise a very important question, which is, when you talk to someone who subscribes to this view, they sort of absorb the end goal of spirit, honor, recognition, glory, and they see that as simply another desire, alongside lust, alongside the need for sleep, for shelter. Why break these things out in the Platonic view? Because it's readily understandable why reason is different from desire. But why make the further distinction between social desires and what we might call like physical desires?
Well, good question. You probably wouldn't need to if you were just thinking in terms of faculties and as static things. But it's because Plato is interested in a command structure of desires. That spirit is particularly interesting because it can ally itself with either side. So reason can convince or co-opt, depending on how you think of this, can co-opt spirit into being its ally, just as the philosopher rulers have the soldiers as their allies in defending the state and indeed in policing the state, as the analogy is paid out. But reason can also side with the lower appetites.
This is the oligarchic man who tyrannizes. His desire tyrannizes both reason and spirit, right? So spirit is almost this middle term. That's what you're suggesting.
Yes.
And there's a competition of who's gonna rule the spirit. And to translate that to modern languages, whether you live a philosophical, rational life and spirit is directed in a rational way, or you let your lowly animal appetites direct who you give recognition.
And the reason spirit is worth distinguishing here is because spirit is going to honor only those who look up to those who make money. That's a different thing from just I want money, and the more immediate desire. It's something that will determine how your life goes, if that's where you really put your value, your social value, and how you value yourself.
I want to compare the Platonic soul to another conception of soul, not the Homo economicus, but the Stoic conception of the soul. Because for the Stoics, they also recognize spirit, social drives, as well as desire. But I think the key difference between the two types of souls is that reason permeates the entirety of the soul in the Stoic model. So I think the Stoic would say, if you desire, let's say, a beautiful woman, that is not just hormones and an animal impulse through evolutionary mechanisms. You are actually, however implicitly, assenting to the proposition, she is beautiful and it would be appropriate for me to make a move right now. And I find that very curious because we tend to think of Plato as having a very rational view of human nature. But compared to the Stoics, these two parts of the Platonic soul, spirit and reason, spirit and appetite, are actually deeply unreasonable in the sense that you can't just use reason to correct wrong assumptions beneath them.
Yes, well, I think Plato thinks it important that the philosopher acknowledge his humanity, acknowledge that these biological and social drives in me are crucial to my human life, and I have to make the best of them that I can. And at least while I am in this life, because the philosopher, the Platonic, the philosopher feels as somewhat marooned here in this world, whereas the Stoic philosopher doesn't. The Stoic philosopher is already a part of the world. The world is God, and he is a functioning part of that machine, and he wants to be the best functioning part of that machine that he can be, and that's why Stoics can legitimately pursue perfection.
Right.
This well-oiled machine can actually really be working fine, and you don't. Whereas for the philosopher, for Plato's philosopher, there's a more tragic consciousness of what it is to be a human being, and that helps him understand what is truly valuable by having this sense of reserve towards being. It's a bit like the Yeats thing, tethered to a dying animal. The Sailing to Byzantium, that poem. You have that feeling. That you want to be part of eternity. I'm still thinking of that poem, but you are tethered. You are tethered here.
Right.
The Stoics are not tethered to their bodies. They're in charge.
I see. So in a way, the purest element of the philosopher's soul, which is the rational part, is almost embedded in a muddy world, or something like that. Embedded in a world that is not worthy of it, but because the soul finds its place here, it still deals with that world. And so, as a result, whereas the Stoic soul sees its own reason reflected in the cosmos, in the logos, in the god or the Zeus that permeates the entirety of the world. And so, practically, I think what that means is that the Stoic sage, like you said, can achieve perfection. And I'll give another example. You see a beautiful woman who's not your wife. And I think the Stoics think you can not have the desire at all for her if you simply don't assent to the wrong sort of rational propositions. Like, she's a beautiful woman, it would be appropriate for me to approach her. Whereas for the philosopher, you tell me if this is right or wrong, the phenomenology is, I'm still going to feel desire for this beautiful woman who's not my spouse. But reason is going to be in full control, and so as well as spirit, and keep appetite in check. So there's a more of a tension in the Platonic soul. Is that right?
And also, yes, I agree. I mean, the Stoics, the Stoics do acknowledge reflexes, like grief, for example. Seneca has a letter where
he says,
"Of course,
you're gonna,
of course, and of course, I feel grief at the death of this, but I don't, as you say, I don't assent to that grief. I certainly don't wallow in it or anything like that. But in Plato, we have more the sense that you can learn. Of course, you have to resist those desires, but you can learn from them.
Right.
You learn about what really matters from them.
One important and, to the modern eye, odd feature of the Platonic soul is that it reincarnates, or so the myths make it seem. One explanation in your book for this is precisely that it's just the rational part that reincarnates. But every time it reincarnates, in a human at least, it finds itself with these two other components that it just has to wrestle with and deal with. But beyond that, is there any other significance of emphasizing reincarnation? And why did he fundamentally think that the soul reincarnates?
This existed in Pythagoreanism before him. I mean, it was an idea and a mythical motif that he could take over from his predecessors and use for his own purposes. When Plato when these myths are featured in Platonic dialogues, he usually has characters, Socrates, for example, Socrates in the Phaedo, for example, give a myth of the afterlife and then say, anyone that would insist that this has to be exactly like I've just told it, that is being silly. But that something like this,
I see. It's pedagogical and literary.
It's pedagogical and literary. It's pedagogical and literary primarily, and the reincarnation, the idea that it's right there in the. I think you may have been channeling the Republic, because there is a myth of the sea god Glaucus. The soul is compared to this god that is all covered in barnacles. And the soul, when embodied, is like this. It's covered in weeds and seaweed and barnacles and so on. And in its true nature, we'll only know that after death. That's a very vivid way of conveying the importance and the fact that what is best about us is our rational part. Also, if reincarnation in the Republic, there's a scene where you have to choose your next life, and you might make a bad choice in the afterlife. It does not cease. There's a long. It's longue durée. There's a long perspective that you have to take on these matters.
I wanted to give our audience an understanding of your methodology with a quote of yours. Take first the mapping of city onto soul. Okay, so this is understanding a city by comparing it to the respective soul. The lives of individuals are more familiar to us than the complex lives of cities. If an oligarchy were a man, it would be a blinkered, conflicted miser. If a democracy were a man, it would be a hopeless lightweight. Anyone attracted to these regimes is encouraged by the analogy to consider them whole and not imagine themselves as members of a privileged class within it. Consider now the converse. The mapping of soul onto city enables us to appreciate complications that the more obvious unity of the individual may have masked. It is all too easy for an individual to ignore his own needs and desires, but project those needs and desires onto the big screen of the city, and each acquires a voice that cannot be ignored. So what Plato gets by comparing oligarchic man to oligarchy, the tyrannical man to tyranny, is actually two things. One, it helps us better understand what is right or what is wrong of the city by intuitively grasping what is right or what is wrong by the man, which we're much more familiar with. But on the converse, it helps us better understand the man by projecting his maybe a bit too intuitive understanding of him onto this big screen. And then suddenly we can see the obvious conflicts in such a soul. Is that right?
Yes. And I should say, this is a persuasive argument. It's not a QED kind of proof. It's not as if Plato, when he was composing all of this, thought, okay, I'll work out this just city, and then I'll perform these. Then there's kind of a mathematical operation, a metaphorical operation of these metaphorical functions that convert it to the individual level. And I say, oh, is that what it turns out to be? And I've suddenly discovered something. It's much more manufactured than that, and made it. He's
playing around with it a lot more, right?
He's making it balance out right from the start. He's looking to both sides all the time. So what's the point of that? Well, it's like at one point he tells Hesiod's myth of the 5 ages of man, where there's a golden age, there's a gold, silver, bronze, the age of heroes gets stuck in there, and then the age of iron, and it's a degeneration overall, and obviously that is his model for the 5 stages from aristocracy all the way down to tyranny, and from the aristocratic man, human being, down to the tyrannical person. These are pictures then that he presents us with, and he wants us to think, oh, I do or do not want to be like that. I do or do not want to live in a city like that. The more he fleshes them out, the more convincing it's likely to be for us. But then, when he goes back and forth, such that if an oligarchic city were a man, it would be a benighted miser and so on. I had someone once compare that to the game. There's a game, I don't know whether this is just in Britain, called Beethoven, where if X person, if Julia was a composer, she'd be Mozart, and if Fred were a composer, he'd be Beethoven.
Right. Like, which Harry Potter character are you? Something like that. Right.
That's right. There's some truth to it being that kind of a move, but one doesn't want to reduce it to a trivial game, because in that game too, it's actually. There are better and worse answers, and you've got to know a person pretty well to convince the other players that you're getting it right. So there is that aspect to the city-soul analogy, and then there is also a kind of a thing that Plato is encouraging us to do, and also something he's encouraging us to avoid. He's encouraging us to not see ourselves and not find the meaning in our lives by seeing ourselves always as part of a city. And in a way, this is kind of cutting short the very natural objection that, never mind all this philosophy, that a young person today might well say, never mind all this philosophy, I just want to make the world a better place. And the problem that Plato might find with that is that if that is about you seeing yourself as a part of that better place that you want to make, are you going to get too involved? Is your self-esteem? I know you know a lot about amour propre and so on. Is that going to get too involved? Your sense of yourself is going to be taken up so entirely in your position within this society that when things go wrong, are you going to have any inner resources to call on? On the other side, are you going to if that's your mission in life, are you going to convince yourself that you know better than everyone else, and you're going to tell them how to behave? You're not going to have your doubts about that. If instead of always looking to that middle ground of the social animal moving within society, and this is what I am, and where is my place going to be? If instead we make sense of our lives by thinking, first of all, of the city as a whole, without us in it, but that city, what makes the best city in cityfied terms? And on the other hand, the individual, the best soul, what can I? And you are going to get a more objective, a more meaningful conception of both of those things if you can stand back and take them as wholes. And then the way to bring them together, Plato seems to be recommending by what transpires in the Republic, is you force the philosopher who doesn't think of himself as a social animal, you compel that person, you persuade and compel and bring the power of law to bear on making them do their duty and rule.
Let me draw out what you're saying with a analogy, and you tell me if it's right or wrong. So I built a company in technology, and I see this desire to do good, to make the world a better place, perhaps mischanneled a lot here in San Francisco, where you say, I want to make the world a better place, and I just go build, a social media site that ends up needing to require on getting people's attention in ways that anger a lot of people. In that scenario, you are both creating a worse city, as well as being probably less good of a person as you can be, as if you abstracted yourself from both in the beginning and thought about them separately. Is that roughly what you're getting at?
Yes.
Is that like,
yes,
by constraining yourself to your life now and this world now, you might get a worse version of both?
Yes, and you that's right, because you're going to you're setting out to change things, but as life gets complicated for you, you end up being captured by it. Captured by your customers.
Right.
It's kind of, Plato has an analogy for that as well. The animal trainer who wants to manipulate the animal. This is like politicians and their advisors. The animal is the people. He wants to manipulate them, but he ends up having to dedicate himself to learning the whims of the animal and how to satisfy those.
Right. And as a result, he becomes almost less than human.
Yeah, he becomes the slave to the animal.
I see.
Instead of,
and so,
even if he manages to control it.
Right. In this two-way metaphor of city and soul, is there a dominant pole? I.e., should we read the Republic primarily as an ethical text that simply uses politics as a way to illuminate that, or should the Republic be read as a political text that simply uses these human creatures as a way to understand the good city?
Yes, well, you want a bit of both, but I do think, in other words, some people have seen, some readers of the Republic have thought that the political stuff is really all for the sake of describing the individual, but I find that very hard to accept because we go into so much political detail. I mean, I think Callipolis, the ideal city, which is the name of the ideal city in the Republic, described in the Republic, is a sincerely meant utopia, which is not to say it's perfect. It's a kind of realistic.
But there's
utopia.
no dominant pole.
There is a dominant pole, however, in that which is the individual. So the politics is meant for real, the political pole. It's not simply an instrument.
A pedagogical device, yes.
It's not simply a pedagogical device, exactly. But both the way in which it's told, we move from city to soul all the time, and the individual person was what we initially wanted to, the question we wanted to answer, is a just individual happy and happier than the unjust individual who gets away with his injustice? As we pay out the analogy, we see that it is the individual who can most emancipate himself from the city, who is the best individual, the philosopher. That is where the best life is lived independently of the city, is the upshot of the Republic, but that the best life for a city, if we can call it a life, the best way in which a city can be run, is if that sort of person, for whom saving the world is not their ambition, gets to be the one who saves the world.
Thanks for watching my interview. If you want to go even deeper into these ideas, then join my email list at jonathanb.com. You'll not only get full-length episodes, but also transcripts, book notes, and invitations to my lectures. Now, if you like this interview, I actually filmed another with Professor Ferrari on Plato's Phaedrus, which I think you'll find fascinating as well. You can find links to that interview, as well as everything we covered today in the description, and on my website, jonathanb.com. Thank you.